Is the LUMIX S1ii worth $1,000 more than the LUMIX GH7? Well, in this video, I'm gonna be answering that question and if Micro Four Third cameras even make sense in today's camera market. And quick spoilers for ahead, it is, but I'll get into why later on. And a quick thank you to K&F Concept for sponsoring this video. Talking about the price of these cameras, the LUMIX GH7 retail price started around $2,200, which right now you can probably get around $1,800 to $2,000 currently in the market. Meanwhile, on the S1ii, retail price right now is at $3,200 at launch. Let's dive into talking about the physical build between these cameras and start off with what's similar. Both these cameras do have your front record button, your front/rear tally light. You do have a lock switch that you can customize and lock any certain button on the back of your camera. You do have that same exact type battery. You have a CF Express Type B card and an SD card slot on the side. It has full-size HDMI, USB-C, headphone, and a mic jack as well. But what is the physical differences between both these cameras? Well, the first thing that's going to be the biggest difference is going to be the screen on the back. On the S1ii, it's a tilt-free screen, meaning it can fully tilt down, tilt out, tilt upside down, sort of, tilt out. Meanwhile, on the GH7, which is still a really good screen, can only tilt up and then tilt out. So you get a little bit more flexibility in terms of your positioning of your screen on the S1ii. On the S1ii, you also do have that closed shutter, which is really nice because it does protect that sensor from dust when you are switching out lenses. And then it is a 24 megapixel sensor on the full frame sensor versus a 25 megapixel sensor on the Micro Four Thirds. You do have on the S1ii a dedicated photo, video, and slow and quick switch on the top, which just allows you to have more custom function buttons between your different modes so you can have an entire function button setup when you are set it up in photo mode versus video mode can be completely different function buttons on the camera. On the GH7, you do have physical timecode where you can import your timecode directly into the camera versus on Bluetooth with the S1ii. The GH7 also does have two front dedicated function buttons versus one on the front, which I do like having both to have more customizability. And then also there's going to be a dedicated audio button on the top of the GH7, which is really nice to access your audio menu settings. But overall, I would say the GH7 has a slightly bigger body, even though it's a Micro Four Thirds sensor. The grip definitely feels a little bit more chunky when it's in your hands. Shifting gears, let's talk about the video specs between both these cameras. Both these cameras can shoot in open gate. On the GH7, you are able to shoot in 5.8K up to 30 frames a second. And then on the S1ii, it's going to be 6K up to 30 frames a second. Now, the S1ii does also have 5.1K open gate up to 48 and 60 frames a second. So you get a slow-mo option for open gate recording. Now on the slow-mo options, the S1ii does have 4K 120 frames and 1080 240 frames a second, but in a 16:9 aspect ratio, it is going to have a 1.17x crop on your 4K 120 frames a second. There is no crop on 4K 60 or 48 frames a second on the S1ii, and you can also still shoot in Cine 4K 96 frames a second on the S1ii with no crop whatsoever if you need that slow motion. Now back on the GH7, it has 4K 120 frames and 1080 240 frames a second, and there's no crops whatsoever across the board. One thing that the GH7 does have currently right now that the S1ii doesn't have at the time I'm recording this video is going to be Open Gate Lite. This is basically an MP4 Lite where it's a smaller file size, but it's still shooting in open gate, so you can easily transfer that file directly to your phone via the Lumix Lab app. Now there is differences between the open gate on a full frame sensor versus a Micro Four Thirds sensor, and both have different advantages depending on the scenario. Open gate, if you don't know, open gate primarily just means it's recording on the full width and the full height of the sensor. On full frame, the entire aspect ratio is going to be recording in a 3:2 aspect ratio. Meanwhile, on a Micro Four Thirds camera, it's going to be recorded in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Basically, the big advantage for a Micro Four Thirds sensor, you're going to be getting a lot more height. If you're shooting primarily for social media only, a Micro Four Thirds sensor is actually going to be giving you more height when you're doing full frame equivalents on your lenses. The last video specs that I do want to touch point that both these cameras can do is going to be ProRes RAW internally on the camera. On the GH7, it's able to shoot 5.7K, and on the S1 II, it's able to shoot 5.8K, both up to 30 frames a second in ProRes RAW HQ. Now, all the RAW settings on the S1 II is going to be a pixel by pixel crop, so roughly a 1.5x crop. Meanwhile, on the GH7, 5.7K ProRes RAW does not have any crop to the image besides being a 4:3 sensor. Granted, when you do switch to 4K 60 frames a second in ProRes RAW on the GH7, it does have that pixel by pixel crop, and again, that's already on a sensor with a 2x crop image to full frames equivalent, and then adding another 1.5x crop to the image itself, which I'll talk about the different crops and what that does to your image itself later on in this video. Shifting gears just a little bit, let's talk about the image and the color science with both these cameras. Now, Vlog versus Vlog, the S1 II definitely produces a warmer image overall, and it's a little bit softer. It's similar colors to what the GH6 was, which in my review of the GH6 versus the GH7, I preferred the image and look of the GH6. The GH7 just produces a much more cooler, sharper tones, which can be a pro or a con depending on where you stand. I prefer the softer, warmer image from the S1 II in these images. Now, both these do have a paid upgrade to get ARRI Log C3, so you can have ARRI Log color science directly in your Lumix camera on either the GH7 or the S1 II. Now, ARRI specifically licensed this to Lumix and created these to match with their own ARRI Alexa cameras, and they were the ones who designed this color profile to be directly on your Lumix camera itself. It's a similar thing in case scenario. The ARRI Log C3 on the S1 II produces a warmer, softer image, which I still again preferred overall. Meanwhile, in the GH7, it did lean a little bit more cooler and a little bit more sharper in comparison to the S1 II. And it's also a whole nother side thought, having a full frame sensor from Lumix with all the features and capabilities that the S1 II has with ARRI Log C3 is definitely a huge win because it kind of gets you used to that color workflow. And I'll have an entire video talking about just ARRI Log C3 being in Lumix cameras on this channel. So if you're interested, definitely consider subscribing. Slightly shifting gears, talking about the image quality and dynamic range between both these cameras. Now, the dynamic range, you do get 13 stops of dynamic range on the GH7, and then on the S1 II, you do have 14 plus stops of dynamic range, but there is that dynamic range boost mode as well on the S1 II, and when you turn that on, you do sacrifice a lot on your rolling shutter performance, but you're gonna be getting 15 stops of dynamic range. So for all the clips showing off these cameras in the field has been from today's sponsor, K&F Concept. So I've been using K&F Concept filters since 2016 when I first got into video, and I still use them to this day. But K&F wanted me to show you guys this cool tripod today, which is their 90-inch ultra-high camera tripod. It has this 360-degree panoramic head for those smooth pans. You can also easily rig this up to get those cool overhead shots like these. There's a 22-pound load capacity, and this cool detachable leg can double as a monopod or a walking stick, or a Jedi sword. So there's gonna be a link in the description to check out this tripod if you wanna pick it up yourself. Thanks again to K&F Concept for sponsoring this part of the video. Back in it, I do want to touch point on the differences between Micro Four Thirds and full frame in terms of bokeh and what some of the differences are. Now, there is a common misconception on how the bokeh and aperture works on a Micro Four Thirds camera, so let's clear the air. So for example, if you had a 12mm focal length on a Micro Four Thirds camera, the full frame equivalent is going to be a 24mm focal length on that camera. Now, bokeh will work a little bit differently. If it was an f2.8, on a Micro Four Thirds camera, on a full frame equivalent, the bokeh is going to be looking like f5.6, but you still remain and retain that light of an f2.8. So this is really due to the distance between you and your camera to create this bokeh difference. If it's going to be comparing it to a full frame equivalent, the bokeh definitely looks double what the aperture is. However, you still maintain the light of the same aperture. Now, in my personal opinion, I do prefer the full frame look just because it's easier to get a blurrier background on an f2.8, and you don't need any crazy light lens with an f0.95 aperture to get that similar equivalence in bokeh. Moving on to the autofocus of these two cameras. Both these cameras do have phase detect autofocus and have really, really amazing performance, but here's what the field tests when you're looking between the side-by-side comparison of showing what the autofocus performance looks like. Moving on to stabilization. Lumix is kind of known to having some of the best in-body image stabilization out there. Both these tests are going to be done on a 24mm focal length or equivalent, and the first test is going to be completely off with no electronic stabilization, just the standard IBIS directly out of camera as our base test. The second test is going to be showing that cropless stabilization that the S1ii has, and just the same shot again from the GH7 with just the standard IBIS because it doesn't have cropless electronic stabilization. Then we're going to be moving on to standard electronic stabilization on both these cameras, which is about a 1.1x crop on both these cameras to show that type of performance on there. The final test is going to be high electronic stabilization, getting some of the best electronic stabilization out there on both these cameras, which is about equivalent to a 1.44x crop on both these cameras, really cropping into your image, but getting some of the best electronic stabilization out there. I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts though down below on which stabilization you did prefer, the S1ii or the GH7. Moving away from the camera bodies, let's talk about the lenses and the different advantages for both systems. So which camera should you buy? Let's start off with who should buy the LUMIX GH7. The first people is if you already own Micro Four Third glass and you're just looking to upgrade from the GH5 and you want just to get a similar camera just with better video specs, well, that's where the GH7 just makes a lot more sense because you already own Micro Four Third glass. Also, if you're just getting into video and you're not necessarily thinking about seeing video as a career per se, or you like the advantages of having telephoto lenses, or you're a wildlife photographer, or you're going on hikes and you want those lighter lenses, that's where the GH7 definitely would take the cake. Plus, you're saving $1,000 more when you're getting the GH7 because it's $1,000 less. You could bid that $1,000 to a ton more pieces of equipment like lighting or audio or grip, and all of that equipment will live a lot longer over time because it's something that you can just buy and use over time. And meanwhile, on camera bodies, this is something that tends to be switched out every couple years or so. So who should buy the LUMIX S1ii? The real question is it worth spending $1,000 more on a camera that has very, very similar video specs and capabilities as the GH7? Ultimately, I would say yes, and here's why. The S1ii, even though it has very similar video specs and capabilities, I would say and argue that the color science is a lot nicer and warmer on the S1ii. Having open gate 60 frames a second is a huge win. And then just in general, most and majority of camera companies are investing in full frame sensors more than they are in crop sensors, APS-C sensors, or even Micro Four Thirds sensors, just in general. And if you don't believe me, the two companies I'm comparing in this video, over just the last 4 years as I'm recording this video, LUMIX themselves have released 6 full frame phase detect autofocus cameras for the L mount system. Meanwhile, they've only released 2 Micro Four Third cameras during that time. And majority of those full frame cameras had full on global or local launch events for those different cameras. Meanwhile, the GH7 and the G9 Mark II didn't get as much glory light in comparison to the full frame sensors, just because in general, the majority of camera industries are focusing on the full frame sensor in that entire ecosystem as a whole. But also investing into the future of L mount as a whole allows you more opportunities and roadmaps to decide what camera systems you want to invest in later on in the future. For example, if you want to shoot on Blackmagic design and more of a cinema style camera like the Pixis 12K or the Pixis 6K, or you want to go to DJI and have the Ronin 4D chicken head camera thing, or you want to go to Leica, or you want to go to Sigma. There's a lot more options with the L mount system, and just in general, the L mount is definitely growing a lot more over time. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, the LUMIX GH7 or the LUMIX S1ii. What are your guys' thoughts between both these cameras? I definitely get it that $1,000 more is definitely a hard pill to swallow for the LUMIX S1ii. It's a better comparison though if you compare it to the LUMIX S5 IIX. And if you want to see that video of me comparing this similar price camera, the LUMIX S5 IIX versus the GH7, check out that video right there. YouTube recommends you might like this video right here. Until the next one, guys, peace.